I want to talk about the narrative strategies that our writers use, which have been inspired by texts like the Panchtantra and the Kathasarit Sagar. In the first place, there are multiple levels of narration. So we have multiple levels of narration. We have, for instance, we have Lord Shiva narrating a story. Then we have Gunadhe narrating the story. Then we have Narvahan Dutt narrating his stories, and they are all one inside the other. So this is a metafictional device that we are familiar with, or framed stories as they're called. The outermost frame is the frame that has Lord Shiva and Parvati. And then there are side stories, there are parallel stories. There are analepsis and prolepsis. What do I mean by analepsis and prolepsis? That means flash back and flash forward. When we read Indian writing in English, we find that there are flashbacks and flash forwards. I'm not saying that you don't find these elements elsewhere. What I'm saying is that our narrative strategies are derived from ancient classics. And that goes for other world literatures too, that they also derive from the oral tradition. They also go back to Aesop's fables, for instance. They go back to the Arabian Nights. There is a commonality in the way stories are told. Question comes up, is there a didactic element in literature? Is there a didactic element in Indian writing in English? I want you to make a note of it so that we can discuss it when I finish this PPT. You will have to tell me whether there is a didactic element or not, whether the writer is writing according to an agenda or not, whether he should or she should have a didactic element. You will have to tell me. And the last point on this slide is that these stories that we narrate today, that we used to narrate earlier, they are all reflections of the society in which we live. Not just the sensibility of the writer, but also the society in which the writer is placed. The writer holds up a mirror to the times through his or her stories. Now, in the same context, we can talk about the Ramayana also. The Ramayana also has a number of narrators, And for instance, we have Valmiki's Ramayana. We have at one point, Love and Kush also become narrators where they narrate the story to Ram and so on. So we have multiple narrators. And in other texts also, in the books that we read today, we have not just one narrator, but we have other narrators too. The same is the case with the Mahabharata. The big three out here before you, they are concerned with society and they experiment with narratology. You have to agree that at the time when they were writing, Indians were not comfortable with the English language the way they are comfortable with it now. Now you can think in the English language, you can dream in the English language, you can argue in the English language. But when these people started writing, there was still that hesitation. There was the tendency to translate Indianisms, Indian phrases into English. So that fluency is sometimes missing. Some of the titles mentioned here are what you would be familiar with. Train to Pakistan, All About H. Hatter, Midnight's Children, The Great Indian Novel, or Rat. And these writers are writers who have made a name for themselves in the English-speaking world also. Khushwant Singh, Desani, Salman Rushdie, Shashi Tharoor, all these are names that go around the world. That I would say is the older generation. But then we have the newer generation also. We have people like Kuratulen Haidar, Mahashweta Devi, Shashi Deshpande, O.B. Vijayan, Arvind Adiga, Vikas Swarup, Gurdyal Singh, and so on. You will say that not all of them write in English, and that's very right. Not all of them write in English. Some of them write in their own language, but their works are translated into English. So when we talk about Indian writing in English, we are referring not just to books that have been written originally in English, but also books that are now available in the English language. In India, when we look at the literary scene, we see that there are a lot of traditions that come and go, traditions in writing that come and go. For instance, of late, we have what is called the chicklet. What is the chicklet? We have the chicklet, and the other side, the other gender would be the ladlet. That means literature for young girls, literature for young boys. I don't know what you think of it. Make a note of it. We can discuss when I finish this. Chicklet and ladlet. Chicklet and ladlet would be literature written for a fairly juvenile audience, not the mature adult, not the mature reader, but perhaps these youngsters, who who feel that they are at the threshold of the world. The world is opening up for them. They have everything at their feet, and they're the kind who revel in great music and perhaps intoxicants, drugs, and so on. That superficial kind of life. I guess we have some students who are interested in literature like that, but will it endure? Will it really last? I'm not so sure. So the question that comes up is, what is it that endures? When we talk about Indian literature in English, we have all these types of genres coming up. What will endure? Well, what endures the test of time is that which has certain values which cut across generations. So if you are reading something that your father or your grandfather used to read, that means that has endured, and that is not a passing phase. It's not just a passing fad. There are, as Northrop Frye said, there are certain motifs, certain patterns that retain their appeal, that appeal to us again and again. There are some themes that appeal to us again and again, and we love literature that is based on those themes. There is what Jung called a collective unconscious. And if literature appeals to that collective unconscious that we have, then you can be reasonably sure that this literature will be around for a long time. There are certain common story patterns. Continuing the same point, there are certain common story patterns, and critics like Vladimir Propp, Levi Strauss, Northrop Frye, J.M. Coetzee, Walter Benjamin, they've all talked about how there are certain stories which cut across time and space. You can find those stories everywhere in a slight variation here and there, depending on the context, depending on the teller, depending on the narrator, depending on the narrative. And this quote from Walter Benjamin is important. Narrative is the art of repeating stories. A story is like a ladder extending downward into the interior of the earth and disappearing into the clouds. That means it's rooted in a particular place, but at some point it reaches out to a common space. Right. Let's take So this is the transculturality of a literary text. How a literary text cuts across cultures. Let me give you the example of Slumdog Millionaire. What was Slumdog Millionaire? It was a book, Q&A. Q&A by Vikas Swarup, and was made into a film. What did it focus on? It focused on the slums of Mumbai. And then the film, Slumdog Millionaire, made use of a TV serial, Kaun Banega Crorepati. So that is very Indian. The slums of Mumbai are very Indian. But then Kaun Banega Crorepati was actually a copy of the UK reality game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So here we have East meets West. And the Indian novel in English becomes a very Western film in the hands of the producer Danny Boyle. In other words, it cuts across cultural chronotopic borders. Which brings me to the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is a phrase that our Pradhan Mantri is very fond of using. He uses it all the time, and I think we all agree with what he says, that the world is one big family. And in India in particular, this is the idea that we are trying to promote, that the world is one big family, and we need to treat everyone as a part of our family. Now, this idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it's not new. Excuse me. It's not really new. It is not restricted to India, because even in Africa, we have something similar called Ubuntu. Ubuntu, the world is one. And the idea behind world literature is that through literature, we can promote a better understanding between human beings. I don't know if you subscribe to this, but I strongly believe that if all of us start reading literature, if all of us start reading poetry, the world will be a much better place. We would probably not have Ukraine. We would probably not have what is happening in Gaza. We would not have terrorism. If only we could all turn to literature, turn to poetry, turn to the finer aspects of life. In literature, there can be an intellectual barter system, as Goethe said. Intellectual barter system. Your literature, my literature. Indian literature, Western literature. We trade our literatures. We exchange our literatures. And we exchange ideas too. We exchange sensibility. We exchange different viewpoints. And we realize that there is a commonality between all of us. Right. So I am trying to wind down now by repeating certain ideas. The main preoccupations of Indian writing, what kind of a society do we live in? What kind of a society do we want? Then there are family structures, gender issues, women writers, feminism. All these ideas come into Indian writing in English. And then emerging India, we know that today we are in what we love to call the Amrit Kal. India is marching forward. No matter how critical we may be, we have to admit that in India, we are luckier than a lot of other countries. We are better off than Pakistan, better off than the Middle East, better off than Sri Lanka. We are not starving. Our economy has not gone down. We have everything that we need to be proud of. Yes, we keep cribbing now and then, but that's our birthright, isn't it? And then you notice that a lot of people who come into India from abroad, students, for instance, they don't want to go back. They don't want to go back because they have seen the worst and they know India is far better. So this is the India that our writers like to promote through their works. This is the image that they try to take abroad to readers abroad. Not the earlier ones about Maharajas and snakes and elephants and so on, but the real India that is now emerging. And we have the style that is changing because our vernacular literatures are also coming up. We have a slightly different way of using the language because our mother tongue interferes from time to time. There are dialectical overtones. But it is still Indian writing in English that we practice. We also have traditional Indian theories of language, you know, the Rasa and Vani and which has come down from Abhinav Gupta and so on. So we have all that also. And our departments of English are now not only teaching Aristotle, they also teaching our traditional Indian theories. In contemporary Indian writing in English, we have new themes coming up, gender issues I've mentioned, the feeling of liberation. We are no longer constricted. Yes, there are people who are in the remote countryside. They do not have the liberties that we have in metros, but things are changing. Then we also have Kindle books. A lot of Indian writing in English is published through Kindle. If you haven't tried that, try it, please. It is not difficult to publish in Kindle. A lot of our literature is AI generated, artificial intelligence. And we have heard so much about ChatGPT taking over the writer's job. But ChatGPT is not human. You and I are human beings. You and I can tell a story which is different from the story told by a machine because it will have human emotions. Then there is Indian writing in English for OTT and for films. That has become very popular. And I find that in a lot of literature festivals now, the writers who are being called are not the writers who are writing and publishing traditionally. They are the ones who are writing for the screen, for television, for films. That is also that also comes under Indian writing in English. But I don't know how seriously scholars like you and me would take this literature because that has a commercial angle to it. One of the subtopics of your conference really intrigued me, Indian literature and the Anthropocene. What do we mean by the Anthropocene? Evidently, it is literature that is concerned with climate changes. We are talking about global warming. We are talking about the melting of the ice cap. And we are talking about environment. We are talking about all these meetings which are held all over the world to discuss climate change. We're talking about the changing landscape, demography, and so on. So all that comes under Anthropocene. But this is not a new subject in Indian writing in English. We have always been concerned with climate, with nature. And in fact, the Indian sensibility, the reflective Indian sensibility, is that which is drawn towards different aspects of nature. We find that all our holy places are by the banks of a river, or they are on top of mountains, because nature is so important for us. However, today this subject has assumed a great importance because we seem to be heading towards some kind of a catastrophe. Now we come back to this question which I had just hinted at earlier. Should there be an agenda in our writing? And what kind of Indian writing in English do we need to promote? Put your thinking caps on and tell me. Then there is also one more issue, literature and the marketplace. What kind of literature sells? Sex, please, and gore? The kind of literature that is written for TV serials, which is full of violence, full of sexuality, full of bloodshed and murder? What is it that sells? And how is literature promoted? What is the use of literature festivals? And then how does a literary text become canonical? These are issues that scholars and critics need to ponder upon because they're very serious matters and they contribute towards the making or marring of a literature of a place. And what endures the test of time would be prose, for instance, the kind of prose that Rabindranath Tagore wrote. So we need to have some quality control, not just in India, but all over. And with that, I would like to stop at this point and say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this enlightening keynote address. We really enjoyed your address and learned a lot. Thank you once again, ma'am, for sparing your time. It's time to listen to the words of another dynamic personality, Dr. Himanshu Parmar. He is presently working as chairperson and associate professor of English, Himachal Pradesh University, Shimla. His educational qualifications are PhD, UGC NET with JRF. He has already had more than 14 years of teaching experience. He has published 17 research papers in various journals of national and international repute. Dr. Parmar has 4 books to his credit, 2 single-authored and 2 co-authored. He has presented a number of research papers in various national and international conferences. His areas of interest are marginal literature and alternative literatures. He has chaired technical sessions in different national and international conferences. As convener, he has successfully organized a seminar. Without taking much time, I request Dr. Parmar to enlighten us with his knowledge and deliver the talk. Dr. Himanshu Parmar.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm audible and I'm visible as well, I guess.
Yes, sir, you are audible and visible.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. So good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for the kind words. And I would also thank IB College for giving me this opportunity to be the speaker here for the occasion. Thank you so much. And good morning, Manju, ma'am. I think with what she has said, the things become slightly more difficult, or I think easy as well for me. It's a contradiction, but still, because Manju ma'am is very senior to me, and when I was taking my first baby steps in this profession, she was already an established teacher at that time, and I remember I can support it with evidence. I went for a refresher course, ma'am, and I wrote a book review on the Scandal Point. पंजाबी यूनिवर्सिटी पटियाला में रिफ्रेशर था तो वहां पे जब प्रेजेंटेशन दी थी that presentation mine was on this Scandal Point. So at that time I was just new into my profession. You were an established writer at that time, so of course it was a pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much, ma'am. So I'll also start with my presentation. Screen share. All right, my screen is visible.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Right, ma'am. Thank you so much. So, of course, Manju ma'am has given us a very good overview of it. And one thing that helped me breathe easy after this was when she mentioned the significance of translations in Indian writing in English. And also she mentioned Gurdial Singh, of course, Punjabi writer. So the idea of speaking on this occasion was a big one for me, but when I saw the theme, a lot of thoughts came to my mind, and the idea of English, it struck me a bit. So we have two basic ideas. One, of course, is the notion of the language in which we're writing, and the other is that ma'am used the word sensibilities, I use the word ideology at times. So I thought of shifting a bit towards more into the ideology or the sensibility aspect of Indian writing in English. So Indian writing in English primarily is the mainstream of Indian literature. Other one being, of course, on purely linguistic basis, being regional literature, purely on the basis of language, something that is not written in English. But this mainstream, of course, that we have, it has got its own marginal presences, and which are, because the language is common, it's English, they are largely sensibility based, they are largely ideology based. And I wish to focus on that particular aspect, and that's why I have written Indigenous Literatures of India. As ma'am said, we have this new trend of writers who use English as the medium of writing, in spite of their mother tongue. Of course, none of us has English as the mother tongue, but writers who use English as a medium, as a very deliberate choice, in spite of the fact that they could have written in a regional language. And of course, translations have their sway into writings now. So Indian writing in English is a large canon where we can include, I believe, indigenous literatures. For me, this aspect that I'm taking up today is largely tribal literature that I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about the literal traditions of the First Nations of this place, of India for that matter. That's what I'll be talking about. And instead of talking of them in isolation, just giving the certain features of that, I would like to place it in comparison to the contemporary times in India as well as abroad. So my presentation basically has 5 parts to it. One, of course, is what we consider to be the perfect world in the contemporary times. So it works at the background of the idea that the mainstream literature is largely codified, but the silenced one is a representation of an alternative order, which has a positive distinction from what we read thus far, what we have read thus far. So it's 5 parts. One is the ideal world as we know it, and the second is the problems of the modern world. I picked up global examples, not purely Indian ones, to talk of the magnitude of the problems that we have. The solutions, I'll be talking, that's where I'll be shifting to the tribal literature in English, originally in English, and translations both. And then why do we need to move towards these silences or these marginal aspects for answers? And then is there any kind of a relationship or mutuality that Indian writing in English and tribal literature can share with one another? And then I'll come to my conclusion. So this poem, I guess everybody knows, this is by Tagore, of course. So we dream of a world which is, it's a controversial term, but still it's an uncritiqued American dream, an equitable world where we live together in harmony, a world of plenty. And this brings me to, ma'am must be aware of that. This is by Sant Ram Udasi. He says, and the translation goes as this: when penury does not chase us, when we get to know well-being, then it will be a happy Diwali. So the notion, the use of the words when, it highlights the fact that we yet are not where we want to be as a civilization, or as humanity, where humanity wants to be. So we need a little bit of help. And for that, there's another line by Udasi again, and it says, come here, the ear to my songs, lend me a helping hand. I'm caught in whirlpools, row my boat to the other end. These 2 lines from Udasi have taken from the work called The Ballad of Bansing. It's by Nirupama Dutt. So there these lines are mentioned. So we need something to row your boat, to row our boat to the other end, where we'll have solutions to these, rather we'll reach where we want to, the solutions to the problems we are having when we are moving towards that. What could be those problems? I've just penned down a few of them. And again, these are quotes that I've taken from different texts. As I said, not necessarily Indian. I've mentioned 2 lines from 2 quotes from Indian writers, some from the global framework. So what ails the modern world? Of course, the first line, I'll mention the text alongside as I go ahead. This comes from The Wasteland. It's by T.S. Eliot, we know. The world that we are living in is a very typical world of specializations, where we have a myopic vision towards things. So we are divided into fragments of class, fragments of caste, fragments of race, identity. We have several identities to talk of in a positive and a negative way, of course, both of them going there. And of course, the biggest one, the dichotomy that we have generated between the human and the non-human worlds. So that is one more facet where we have broken our world into smaller sections. So these lines are actually partially from the Bible as well, but this is the first problem that we are facing in contemporaneity a lot. Another one that I think we are all aware of these, so just go through these. Spiritual barrenness. We are too, again, this line again comes from the wasteland, and it refers to the idea of being too much involved in the material, mundane hustle bustle of everyday life that we forget to pull out time for ourselves as an individual, and hence we don't contribute to the society as well. So the spiritual death that is mentioned in these lines is something which is very relevant or very seriously to be pondered over in the contemporary times. Pessimism, of course, this line comes from W.B. Yeats, and it's among school children. That's from where it comes. So it's a mother thinking of a son with 60 or more winters. He doesn't use the word years or summers, he uses winters, indicating the modern age, which is full of problems, 2 world wars and economic depression and all those things, the Irish War of Independence. So the kind of pessimism that has spread around in our lives. So if I contrast it to the poem that we read earlier, I think the fragmented world is, that's what Tagore says, where the mind is without, where the world has not been broken up into fragments, it has been. Similarly, spiritual barrenness, the narrow domestic walls, the pessimism, the dreary desert of dead habit. So a few before we get into the solutions, this is it. A world where there are no principles. This line comes from The Shield of Achilles by Auden. And he talks of a world where people, the poem is about the contrast between ancient Greece and contemporary Greece, a contemporary world rather. And we live in a world where norms and dogmas are centered around chaos and negativity. A world which is more, either it gets too rational or it gets too belief based. So we don't have kind of a balance that is needed. So the principles or a world where we can trust each other is something that is missing. And of course, ma'am mentioned it, the Anthropocene. We know it's just about environment, and this line comes from Going by Philip Larkin. That's the poem we have mentioned. I remember Professor Kapil Kapoor once saying that he says, we have a knack as we have modernized ourselves. And the knack is that we create a problem and then we open a department for it. And you always mention the Department of Environmental Sciences for that. I'm sorry to be mentioning that, but still. He always says, you first exploit nature and then you set up a department to find out how to go about healing it. So the modern world works on the principle of greed. Of course, it's not need-centered. So there are certain environmental concerns that we are going through nowadays. Of course, the last one is Indifference. It's a poem by Auden which deals with the fall of Icarus. It's a myth. It refers to a myth and how nobody bothers when he falls down. It highlights the way people have become increasingly self-centered. I remember an incident a few years ago when there was an old man living in a house and he was not seen for a week or something like that. And then a foul smell started emanating from his house. And that is when the neighbors realized that the old man had died a week ago. So that's the kind of indifference that has crept up in our lives. And of course, we are conscious, aware, educated, intellectual people. We've always tried to find answers to our problems. But as I said, Udasi says that we still are not there where we need to be. So what are the solutions that probably we can think of? There are 2 basic streams of solutions. If I look at literature, and we're dealing with Indian writing in English. So this is where I'll shift not to the mainstream of Indian writing in English, which deals with the major writers who wrote in English, starting with the big 3 and then moving on to writers like Rushdie or Shashi Tharoor, or for that matter, even Kiran Desai and Anita Desai's daughter. We won't go into that, but we will shift towards something completely different. As I said, the common platform that I'm creating here is the platform that these are texts that are either primarily written in English or texts which have been translated into English, so that the canon of Indian writing in English, as ma'am said, we need to expand it. I have taken the liberty of doing that for my presentation. So of course, the word tribalization, this was given by S.L. Kalia in a text called Indigeneity Tales and Alternatives. That's where we find this term. But as I said, the 2 kinds of solutions, the solutions which are from the known, a phrase I use a lot. These are the solutions coming from the mainstream. And these solutions, I find, Of course, there would be exceptions. I cannot deny that. But if I look at a general flow of the solutions that we have offered, they are largely abstract by nature. They're largely abstract by nature. Even if I move out of the domain of Indian writing, if I move on into a very seminal text of the Western world, the wasteland, T.S. Eliot mentions the three das towards the end of the wasteland, Datta, Dayadham, Dameta. But how do we go about it? It's mentioned it's taken from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, but we still don't know how to go about executing the three das. Similarly, if you pick up, I mentioned Kiran Desai, if you pick up the inheritance of loss, the problem of identity that Jemubhai Patel has, the solution that he finds is staying aloof and not talking to anybody. Or if I go a bit ahead, apart from abstract answers, we have elitist answers. This is a phrase I'm deliberately using here. The mainstream Indian writing in English uses some elitist answers in terms of a spiritual superiority, the highest form being salvation or moksha as we call it. A very good example comes from U.R. Ananthamurthy's Samskar. That is one of those texts. And even in The Vendor of Sweets, when R.K. Narayan, Jagan at one place in the text, he thinks of the stars, talking about the kind of constellations that are there, and if they were his ancestors watching him, what he's doing. Or even if I move a bit ahead, there are texts like Untouchable by Bulkraj Anand, where there is a very hegemonic solution to the problem of caste. I'm primarily dealing with tribals here, but some passing references to caste would also be there. So Untouchable, you have a very hegemonic kind of a solution where Bakai is told that he needs to clean toilets manually till the flush system comes in as it has been promised. So we get these kinds of answers, but yet we know that the problems have persisted. They are not yet over. So is there a world for us which, if projected before us, can present some viable, tenable, practical solutions to the problems, something that can row our boat across, as I mentioned in that Udasi's poem earlier, something to row our boat across. And I'm trying to do that by talking of tribal literature. So I shall focus on this alternative, the unknown, as I call it, the marginal. So the quote you can obviously read there, and this reminds me of some very good lines by a poet, a Punjabi poet again, Pash. He says, this I'll speak in Hindi. So, लेकिन शब्द ना तो डरते हैं ना मरते हैं, उन्होंने रक्त सनी मिट्टी में कभी खमीर नहीं आने दिया, जो दिन के अंधेरे में वर्जित होता है. Din here refers to the mainstream. जो दिन के अंधेरे में वर्जित होता है, उसे रात की रोशनी में कर दिखाते हैं. So night refers to the unknown, the tribal world. So I'll try to pick instances from tribal literature in English, present them to you as a different facet of Indian writing in English. So of course we know tribals and of tribals and of the marginals, their folk tales are very central to their representation of their life. And they're very close to their life, and I'll come to it as I give examples of the solutions that we have. So here is one. So I picked up the same points that I mentioned in the problems: fragmented world, spiritual barrenness, pessimism, principles, Anthropocene, indifference. I picked up a slide each. Now these are all either some folktales in English or some critics commenting on the tribal world. And you can see how each tries to answer the problems that we have. So when you look at the fragmented world, we realize that the tribal world is primarily in sync with the basic principle of nature, which is being comprehensive, not exclusive, rather being inclusive and including everything in it. And tribals, in spite of their being illiterate, I'm focusing on illiteracy because it comes later, yet they understand the basic communing principle to a happy life. So for them, the fish, the tree, nature, and humans are not different categories. Their sensibility, their line of thought, which might be primitive but not pre-logical, will not acknowledge the fact that the world is fragmented into human and non-human. So they keep that open-endedness around them, offering space to deviations. And there is a very good line in Mamang Dai's The Legends of Pensam, a text written primarily in English. It's a northeastern text. And there he says, when the character says, strange things have happened in the world. Why are we so keen on making sense out of it? Let them be. So let them be a part of it. So they acknowledge those deviations, which helps them have a very comprehensive view of the world around them. Spiritual barrenness, the next one, of course. This again is a line from The Legends of Pensam by Mamang Dai, as I said. The basic idea of living in the present is central to the tribals. And they work on the principle that life is supreme. And this life for them is lived every day. In fact, I belong to Himachal primarily, and I belong to Kullu basically, which is one of the, people call it not so tribal, but I, being a native, understand that it has its tribal connections. We, by connecting with everything around us, including our deities, nature, we have that ability to believe that life is supreme, and that helps us overcome the spiritual barrenness that is there. It also helps us to cope up with the changes that might come about in life. So we won't be like the people of London in the wasteland who are spiritually dead but physically alive. So, and of course, the next one was pessimism. If you look at the tribal life, and these are the last lines of Mamang Dai's The Legends of Pensam, and you'll find all these are intricately connected to each other. I've just picked up examples to separate them, but they are very cohesive with each other. So of course, the solution to pessimism is, as I said, the acknowledging that diversity and change, that heterogeneity is the norm of living. The idea that things cannot remain as they were, that things will change with time. And then in the middle of that change, you find certain things to stick onto. That helps them. And it happens largely because of the faith that they have in their culture. So just to give you more examples from literature itself, if we pick up Mamang Dai's text, or we pick up any tribal text, widow remarriage, or even if not remarriage, the right to live is granted in absolute terms to the lady. Similarly, in Mamang Dai's The Legends of Pensam, there's a girl who runs away with, not in Legends of Pensam, rather, it's there in that text as well. Is there another one of Mamang Dai's text? It's called The Black Hill. Even in that one, a girl, she goes back when she goes away when she falls in love with a boy. Then she later on comes back and she's welcomed with open arms by the society because they believe in that basic right to live. These small things help them cope up with the solutions, with pessimism. So they have a very practical way of handling it. Similarly, if you look at the solutions to a principle-less world, as we were saying, here is a culture which believes that the values and traditions, very close to what even in the Western world WBS mentions in A Prayer for My Daughter, values and traditions and customs are not compromisable. They are to be followed, and they are to be followed in letter and spirit. In fact, this is one of the major factors which has kept the tribal culture alive till date. There's a very good quote in Mamang Dai, and it says, when I had spoken of Adila's autism, he had listened. He is a tribal. He had listened and understood and been able to express his sorrow for Mona quietly. Whereas I had to look up the term in the library when she first told me. I had been too troubled and agitated to share her grief. So the difference between an illiterate tribal, and this is very interesting because Kapoor sir always says an illiterate person is somebody who's a victim of the modern education system. But being illiterate, he went to the dictionary. He, being illiterate, was still focusing on the understanding of what was being said. And if you look at their rituals, I'll give a few examples to you. And probably this is the only rigid part of their life where they do not deviate from the norms. In Adi culture, there is the practice which is called Kiruk. Kiruk is the hunting tradition. And it's a ritual that they perform before and after hunting. And this ritual in tribal world includes praying before hunting and thanking the prize, the animal that has been killed after hunting it, for providing the tribals with food. So in a world where we live in a world where we don't value the other person, here is a culture finding its expression in Indian writings in English, but we don't think of it because we are still into the mainstream, who have answers to the problems of a principle-less world. We came to Anthropocene. Now, this is very interesting here because what is happening with Anthropocene is it's not only the fact that there's a problem with forests, but we are blaming the tribals for the cutting of the forests. And this is something which is not understandable to a tribal mind. I'll read a quote from a text, an Odia text. It's called Paraja by Gopinath Mohanty. And the text, the line goes something like this. Sukrujani's wife, Sombari, we are told, was dragged away one day by a man-eating tiger as she collected dry twigs in the forest. Sukrujani suffers, but for him, this event is comprehensible. It is a part of his life. What he cannot comprehend, however, is the infinitely convoluted process by which he and his children are transformed from free men into goatees. Goatees are bonded labor forever. He cannot comprehend why a man should be arrested and fined for cutting down trees in a jungle. Their gods and goddesses are much too simple to be of much help. So they have a kind of, what do I say? It's a kind of an understanding with nature, an agreement where they know how to go about handling natural resources. But we, by virtue of our mainstream intellect, believe that the tribals need to be put into the categories where rules should be imposed on them for not cutting trees or for doing things. So we don't think that they know how to handle it. And of course, these trees and forests have sustained the tribals for centuries. Now they are in trouble because of our greed. They use it as per their needs. So tribals did not demolish trees. We did, and we are blaming it on them. So solution to the Anthropocene is, as even Manju ma'am said, that our temples are near rivers and forests. In tribal culture, forests are the deities. Trees are the deities. There are no deities on trees. They are the deities. The mountain doesn't have a temple. The mountain is the temple. That difference is something which they have been talking of in their culture, but we are not aware of them. So we need to go about understanding these things. And so, of course, indifference here, I'll shift to caste a little bit, a couple of slides on that. But if you look at this notion of indifference, something very interesting in the northern part of the world, even in the Punjab, because I remember these lines actually come from what Manju ma'am mentioned, Gurdial Singh. The text is Marida Diva, translated into English by Ajmer Singh Road as The Last Flicker. So it talks of a system called, the word is Seri. We call it the Sanji system, where a lower caste family is attached to an upper caste family. It's there in Himachal as well, in my part of the world, where they call it the Betu system. And there we as upper caste attach ourselves to a low caste family with two basic ideas: the sense of security. So low caste being financially unstable, financially weak, not having access to land, were offered help or were given help by the upper castes. And in return, they used to do work in kind for us. In kind means they could cut the trees for us, they could do some field work for us. In return, we normally gave them one field that was for them to use. So it gave them a sense of security and also a sense of subsistence, because they know that in bad times, it's the duty of the upper caste family to take care of the low caste family. It's the unwritten, unsaid rule that is followed, or that has been followed for ages in the tribal or in the Dalit world. So this is again something which highlights that indifference has no place in village life. I give my students an example many times. I say that, you know, in a city, if you are sick or if you're not seen for a couple of days, probably one or two of your close friends might call up. But in a village, if you're not seen for a couple of days, the entire village reaches your home, trying to find out if something has gone wrong. We still don't lock our houses. We keep them open. Tribal worlds work on that principle of mutual survival. There are many examples of that. Community feasting is a very good example of that, where if the animal is cut, the portions are cut equally and given to all the families in the house, in the village, not house, I'm sorry. So indifference does not have a place. Pessimism does not have a place. Principles do have a place in a unified world of the tribals. And it is evidently found in their literature. So it's very pertinent for us that in Indian writing in English, we need to give space. And this is what I mean when I wrote that in the 5th slide, that we need to deal with tribalization. So it's a word that has been used a lot. So some more solutions, if we look at the practical side of life, as I said, widowhood, it's something which is very natural in the tribal life. And of course, filicide, which again is a very serious problem nowadays. You can read it. And I'll read one quote by one of the finest anthropologists and a person who is an expert on tribal life, Verrier Elwin. And he says, there are many elements in the Gond ethos, Gonds are a tribe, which should be conserved. Their simplicity and freedom, their love for children, the position of their women, their independence of spirit, their freedom from many of the usual Oriental inhibitions. So the tribal indeed has for us a message for our sophisticated modern world, which is under threat of disintegration, that there has to be love and concern for everyone if we have to live a happy life. And happiness brings me to this point that for us, even happiness or prosperity has a very different definition, because we have been brought up that way through the mainstream or through the codified ethos of writing or understanding life. Theirs is not a world which is rich in money. Theirs is a world which is rich in culture. Theirs is a world which is rich in traditions. Theirs is a world where they know the meaning of actually being alive. The irony is prosperity, we understand in a very different way. So we are like, they're very poor, but they actually are not poor about it. So we as the mainstream, we either deal with the material phases, what Eliot mentioned, or we deal with spirituality, as I said, Samskar mentions. We deal with moksha or we deal with material worlds, but here is living, being and living in coherence with the nature and with the customs. So that connect is very, very important. So the idea of praying before a hunt, or when they went for hunting, they came back, they erased their footsteps so that the evil spirits may not follow them. So just ways of handling their lives on an everyday basis. And this is not unique to the Indian tribes. All across the globe, if we have a look, and I'll read one quote, and this is how it goes. Native Americans, it's written here, I'll read the remaining part of it. It says, like them, the Sobos are a hunting tribe, Native American tribe, will beg forgiveness if they are forced to fell a tree. You are our friend. I do this because my wife doesn't have any food. My son doesn't have any food. My daughter starves. This line I have taken from Mahashweta Devi's Imaginary Maps. That's where she quotes these. So all across the world, and even if we read William Carlos Williams' poetry, we'll find similar references to the native life. Australian Aborigines, the actual Aborigines, as we call them, they were the people, who say, and I remember once I was watching a cricket match, and there was a tribal who inaugurated it, because Australia now has come a long way acknowledging the tribals there. And he said this, he said, this is our land. We talk softly here. We walk softly here. We respect everyone here. So this is something which is very comprehensive. Something in Indian writing in English that, if explored, can answer a lot many things for us. Why do I feel that indigenous literatures or tribal literatures does have answers to the problems of the modern world. This line that I've mentioned here, again, it comes from Mahashweta Devi's Imaginary Maps again. And the second quote is very interesting. It actually comes from Asur by Anand Neelkantan. It's a representation of Ramayana from Ravan's perspective. This is Ravan speaking actually in the second quote. So the tribals, I believe that they are a sect of people who have an ethos and value system, which is, and accordingly a mythos, which is completely different from what we are used to watching. And I say that with a lot of emphasis, because once I remember in another program where I was presenting a paper and I was talking of representations, one of the persons, he got up and said, you know, representations of myths are not a very good idea because it confuses us. We are not comfortable with those deviations. It doesn't work that way. That's why I'm emphasizing on it. They are First Nations. First Nations is a term for the people who came to the place first. It's a term in place of Adivasi, if you want to use it that way. So First Nations, the communities, the ethnic communities who settled down in a place with their little cultures, small traditions, simple lives, and two principles which define First Nations, the tribals. One is they are heterogeneous to one another, and they are heterogeneous or different in contrast to the mainstream. There have been attempts at homogenization. We've always done that, and that is where I wanted to talk on this particular topic, because the overarching the tendency of putting the tribals under the belt of the mainstream, if I call it Hindus, recent trend that has come up, it's just slightly problematic. And I'll give reasons for that why. There is a quote by Kancha Ilayya in Why I'm Not a Hindu, and it says, people belong to a religion only when they know that they are a part of the people who worship that God. When they go to those temples and take part in the rituals and festivals of that religion. My parents had only one identity, and that was their caste. They were Kurumas, shepherds. Their festivals were local. Their gods and goddesses were local. And sometimes these were even specific to one village. No centralized religious symbols existed for them. So, is there a distinction? Or I'm just speaking in abstractions like the mainstream? I have four arguments to put forth my point that they are a different order. And that is why when we don't have answers in the mainstream, we might have answers in indigeneity. The first one is, theirs is a culture which is based on the word we use as lived experience, the concrete life of their routines and survival. It might, as I said, it's not pre-logical. You know, Levi Brule said that myths are pre-logical, but it's primitive, but it's very logical. They survive on a daily basis. So theirs is a lived experience. It's not based on theory. And I'll come to that, which connects me to the second point. Theirs is an ethics of caring. We have an image of tribals, which is that of a brute. But the fact is, by their comprehensiveness of life, by their mutual relationship, they have an ethic of caring and not an ethic of daring or doing something against the grain. And of course, their focus, which connects to the first point of lived experience, it focuses on this world and not the other world, not the notions of salvation for that matter, but what you are doing in this particular world. So this worldly principle, of course, there might be life after death, but who knows? So they focus on living in the present. So it's not about thinking of something which is not even in front of us, but something that is very concrete, just not moksha. The only text which of the list that I mentioned earlier, I mentioned Samskar, I mentioned the vendor of sweets. If you create an hierarchy, one text that I would place is, it's a Dalit text, but Gurdiyal Singh's Madida Diva. There, Jagsir's concern is survival. This is the bottom of the pyramid, survival. Then you move up with the vendor of sweets, deals with the kind of, my son is not good, I need to keep money or not. It's slightly higher. And then Samskar right at the top of the pyramid, where we need salvation, mukti, from all the worldly affairs. But tribal literature, it focuses on this world. And of course, all this works at the back of the unbreakable bond that the tribal community shares with nature. It's the noble savage being lived every day. So this is where I believe that they are a completely different order, and therefore it's very significant that we go around understanding and studying these people. And of course, they are very loyal to their culture. That is one thing that has helped tribals a lot. But still, in the wave of mainstreaming, homogenizing, the indigenous literature is under threat. Indigenous, here I mentioned one tribal, one Dalit, both the cases. And there are two things which are very important. One is the otherness of the tribals is being decimated, or rather the tribals are being decimated because of their otherness by a hegemonic and coercive mainstream, or the dominant section, the self. So it's overshadowing the tribal existence. So even when we talk of Indian writing in English, we focus on the Rushdis, we focus on the Tharus. So we don't focus on this unknown section of Indian writing in English. And of course, the lack of a written document, because it's largely oral, it kind of helps the cause, in single quotes, of hegemonizing the tribals. But one more thing, looking at it from the other point of view, in order to get out of that otherness, there has been an increasing tendency of assimilation. It's a major issue with the tribal life. They're trying to assimilate with the mainstream so that they can, in a way, belong there, which is harming the indigenous cultures. And if this happens, if the indigeneity is decimated, if it is annihilated, we shall lose out on a very tenable, feasible, alternative social order, which has the answers to our problems. And this is where I believe Indian literature can be of great help. Indian literature can be the one that preserves the tribal literature by offering one standard language. English, the common one, because there are many tribes who don't have a script of their own. They can, the other way around, rather, it's not language, I'm dealing with Indian literature. They give that ambit of coverage and they protect the indigeneity of tribal cultures. And I say this on the back of a very solid idea that in spite of being very open to things, ritually, the tribals are still a very fixed or a rigid community, not in the negative sense, but in the sense that they can be written down in literature and still preserved. So Indian literature can be the one who can do it. But having said that, it's equally important. As I said, the second thing is, of course, it can offer that one of the themes is their Indianness to the indigenous. So they can feel, especially with the Northeast, they can feel a sense of being a part of India. But then two things are extremely relevant here when we look at this importance. One is we have to understand that tribal literature is an aesthetics and a sensibility of a different kind. So even if it comes under Indian literature, its nomenclature under Indian literature, its nomenclature still remains tribal literature, with the subservience, in single quotes, the subservience to Indian literature coming with the principle that the word Indian in Indian literature will be a geographical entity and not a cultural one. Because if we look at it as a cultural entity, then Indian literature will subsume tribal literature as homogeneous, which is not the case. So the politics of ideology needs to be kept away. India needs to be a geographical entity. It's almost like, it's Indian literature's responsibility to take care of that. And it's like man's relationship with nature, where nature doesn't need man, it's self-sufficient. Man needs nature. Tribal literature and tribal life is sufficient, but with the increasing interference of the mainstream, it needs to be protected, but it needs to be protected more for Indian literature's own sake. And I'll come to that in some time. So that is one where Indian literature becomes significant. And because we're dealing with Indian writing in English becomes equally important for three basic reasons that I place in this text. And I'm towards the end of my presentation. One is English will help spread the tribal consciousness. It will help spread the tribal consciousness, which is a problem till now because of a lack of a language. So English becomes the common denominator. What it will do more than anything else is that it will take the tribal world, it will take the tribal rather to the world, and which means any imposition of a non-tribal reality on the tribals by the mainstream will be challenged. And there is a quote which says, tribal literature in English counters the imposition of a non-tribal reality of them being savages with no clothes and living in an ethos of daring rather than an ethos of caring. So the misconceptions that we have can be countered if English becomes the common language. Second, of course, the other way around. It will also prevent non-tribals claiming tribal reality to be their own. It's very akin to the problem India had recently with patents. Traditional Indian knowledge was patented by people abroad. They claimed it as their own. They have been doing it for a very long time. That we don't do it with the tribals, as was done with us. It's very important. English plays that role in ensuring that the non-tribals claiming tribal reality as their own is challenged. It's also because the culture is different, so we need to maintain it. And of course, if it goes in English, I guess the problems of the modern world will have better answers. If not exclusive in the tribal world, then a combination or a dialogue between the mainstream and the tribal will bring forth some concrete solutions to us. And I'll come to it. This is what I said earlier. What can tribal literature offer to the mainstream? It can offer them the idea that literature is a combination of the what and how. It's not purely aesthetic. It's not purely thematic. It's a combination, and resistance in literature, projection in literature, they can validly work together. So their tradition, culture, history, exploitation, and its resistance are all collective. They do not demarcate specializations. And I think mainstream literature can pick this cue from them. And of course, by its multiple perspectives, multiple consciousnesses that the ethnic communities, the tribal communities have, will give mainstream or Indian writing in English that extra ambit and scope. It will make it more comprehensive, and it will be more fuller, or fuller in the sense it would have more knowledge than it has now, because it would acknowledge the presence of heterogeneities in a seemingly overarching homogeneous tradition. And of course, Manju Ma'am also mentioned the rich oral tradition is a source of several stories, several narrative styles for the mainstream. That's why I said that for Indian literature's own sake, it is very significant that it takes care that tribal literature is offered its ample space in Indian writing in English. And of course, this is my last slide. I would wrap it up with this here. The tribal literature in Indian writing in English gets your abstractions substantiated. I'll give you examples. The 3 Thous of T.S. Eliot, Datta, to give, the community feasting that is there in the tribal life, the Dayadham, being compassionate, the widow remarriage in the tribal world, the Betu and the Sanji system in a caste-ridden world, the Meta, to practice self-control, the cutting of trees and destroying nature. They live that in concreteness, what we talk in abstractions. Having said that, and the list that I mentioned here, having said that, it's very important that we need to sustain tribal languages and tribal cultures. So we cannot have English at the cost of a depleting tribal culture and language. So we need to be very meticulous, very particular, very careful when we use English to talk of tribal discourses. In English literature has to be wary of dominating tribal discourse all the time through its codified structures. We need to keep the cultural specifications alive. So English, just like India stays as a geographical medium, English stays a linguistic medium and not a cultural medium. The politics of language, it stays away. And this was my presentation. And these terms, Johar basically means when you welcome somebody, it's a salutation and a welcome. Lobi Sandra is an annual community hunt in the Munda tribe. Kiruk, I told you, it's the hunting tradition in the Adi tribe of Arunachal Pradesh. Kibang is the council of elders in Adi community. Donyai Polo are their primary gods. We cannot call them sun and moon. It's typical to their culture. Maranguru is for the Santals. It means the great mountain. Jaherayo means the goddess of the forest, who is the elder sister of the Santals. So we need to maintain this cultural specifications in Indian writing in English if we want tribal literature and Indian writing in English to sustain together with each other. Thank you so much. I think you're on mute yet. I can't hear your voice.
particular idioms, they will definitely enhance your knowledge, expand your intellectual horizon. At the same time, various latest literary trends will also be discussed during this conference. So get ready for having new ideas, new words. I believe that this conference will not merely be a entire
It's borders means roughly 3 other and so on. The words that we
where critical idiom. I like to add here that the contribution of female writers can't
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, you are not audible.
Yes, good afternoon to one and all. Present in the technical session of national level online conference based on Indian writing in English. ऊंचा आसमान पंछी लेते हैं उड़ान, ऊंचा आसमान पंछी लेते हैं उड़ान, वैसे ही अपनी मेहनत से जिन्होंने छुआ है आसमान, पधारे हैं आज इस मंच पर वे मेहमान, करती हूँ आदर पूर्वक उनको प्रणाम, करती हूँ आदर पूर्वक उनको प्रणाम. I, Professor Rekha Sharma, greeting you all. We are really honored to have with us our college governing body, worthy principal, vice principal, head of the English department, delegates, faculty members, and special presence of Dr. Ashok Chaudhary, Principal Markanday National College, Shahabad, as a chairperson in the technical session. Hello, good afternoon, sir. Sir, are you there? Yes, dear delegates, we are waiting for our chairperson. He will join soon.
login का designation.
Hello everyone, we are waiting for our chairperson. There is an error to join us. He will soon join us. We are waiting for him. We are starting our presentation still. Our first presentation is OP number 98, Ramavatar Eklavya, IZU Mirpur Rewadi. Are you there, sir? Ramavatar Eklavya. Okay, Dr. Shivangi, Assistant Professor KV DAV College for Women, Karnal. Are you there, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, start your presentation, ma'am. You have 5 to 6 time limit.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Respected chairperson and fellow delegates, the topic of my presentation is Emergence of Ecofeminism in India Critical Study. Nowadays, ecofeminism is considered as one of the major disciplines in literature due to its significant contribution in interlinking gender and environment in ideological terms. The deep ecological crisis that we are witnessing presently due to massive environmental destruction and the oppression of women in male-dominated society joins the fact that race, class, caste, gender, and environment are intrinsically interconnected. Ecofeminism's main premise is that the patriarchal ideology legitimizing the oppression of women and many other marginalized groups is also that which authorizes the destructive oppression of nature. The present paper is a humble attempt to trace the critical development of eco-feminist thought in India with particular reference to the eco-feminist discourse of Vandana Shiva and her seminal contribution to the construction of an indigenous eco-feminist worldview. Vandana Shiva, a leading Indian eco-feminist, attempts to dismantle patriarchal hegemony in her works. Her ontological vision is rooted in the symbolic association of women with nature. She argues that women in India are an intimate part of nature, both in imagination and in practice. In her works, she turns to traditional Hindu cosmology to explicate the worldview that is needed to restore ecological harmony and balance. She calls for the recovery of the feminine principle to counter the vicious forces of Western male development. She speaks of this recovery not in the Western sense of a dichotomizing of masculinity and femininity as polar binaries. Rather, it is a dynamic interaction of creative energy. According to Shiva, female Shakti, together with male form Purush, produces Prakriti nature. Shiva asserts that the relationship between man and nature here differs radically from the view of man as separate from and dominating over nature. She sees the daily worship of the sacred Tulsi within Indian households as a good illustration of this difference. In India, Tulsi is not worshipped merely as a plant with great medicinal value, rather, it is venerated as the symbol of the entire cosmos. In worshipping the sacred Tulsi daily, Indian women renew the relationship of their homes with the whole cosmos. Shiva does not subscribe to the Cartesian worldview, which views humans as separate from nature. Shiva's call for reclaiming of the feminine principle is a call for immersion in the organic vitality of life itself. In her works, Shiva rejects the Western model of development as highly skewed for its inherent anthropocentric and hierarchical biases. In her opinion, it paves the way for newer forms of dominance of subsistence cultures. She calls for a revised epistemology of inclusive partnership with nature to overcome the present state of environmental degradation. Moreover, she seeks to subvert the dualistic worldview, which views technology as superior to indigenous knowledge. According to Shiva, an alternative worldview marked by collaboration and cooperation alone can liberate both women and nature. She further adds that women have the potential for creating new intellectual ecological paradigms. Their role in circumventing and preventing ecological crises is of utmost importance. She believes that the producers of life alone can be its real custodians. To conclude, we can say that human beings can no longer afford to remain estranged from the environment, as it will further aflame the present ecological crisis. On the contrary, we need to realign ourselves with our natural surroundings, as the failure to do so can land us in a great deal of trouble. The need of the hour is to embrace the eco-feminist ideals of kindness, compassion, eco-justice, love, mutuality, and reciprocity as explicated by Shiva. We ought to build an ecologically healthy world wherein the twin oppression suffered by both women and nature has been completely eradicated. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you,
And-
ma'am. Next is Ramavatar Eklavya, IZU Mirpur Rewadi. Are you there, sir? OP number 98.
Yes, ma'am, I am here from Rewadi.
Yes,
Are
sir,
you
you are
getting me,
audible.
ma'am?
Yes, sir,
Yes,
you are
yes.
audible.
Ma'am, the topic of my research project, study of women across the globe as a unit. Women as a whole, it is a journey of apparently oppressed and perennially perturbing sort of abysmal and melancholy tortuous journey, which is very painful and knowingly dismal and deliberately tortuous, systematically anti-matriarchal and strategically ambivalent, and even glaringly glorious, historically hostile. The journey of woman is conventionally, it is a story of suppressed, oppressed, and venially vexed and scientifically androgynous at all. In my study, I have chalked out certain subjugation policies of the male macro image and marginalization realistically adopted by the male oriented macro image at global level, at national level, and even at regional level. Even state like Haryana, we have been facing various stereotypes and malpractices, biasness, and certain bottlenecks we have been obviously observed in the path of woman, and she is the victim of such a system where woman's status is lower than that of a man. It is a false type of archetypal myth, and where a man obliges a woman by marrying her. Even in Haryanvi culture, it is very much perceived and observed that pseudo-social rituals and rites are prevailing in order to subjugate and marginalize women. A woman's stuff, I have listed various sadistic and masochistic conservationism and obscurantism in the path of woman progress, and to lead a kind of equal journey as a partner. She has been most of the time victim of biases, bottlenecks, and roadblocks by the male Mako image. It is very obvious to highlight that a woman has been still fed up with the global aura of equality and egalitarian society. So far as my study is concerned, I have studied at global level. There are certain myths and certain objects and gross rhetorical devices which are anti-woman and anti-feminine. As a whole, if we look at the things from the global perspective, even in America, black woman is subjected to white woman. She becomes the victim of jibe and a kind of rhetorical subjugation at the hands of white woman. Even in India, we have scheduled caste woman. She may attain any height, even then she may feel belittled at the hands of the rich so-called upper class woman. It is the reality of the time. Woman is sometimes a parasite or a beast of burden, even in rural areas where the peel of equality has not touched, and a mere commodity or a conspicuous consumption, and it may be a doll or a showpiece, even personified frailty, and even the male eco image, and that kind of hostility prevailing in Haryana, or even in so far as female feticide is concerned or NDPTS Act is concerned. Woman is a victim, and at the same time she is a very passive participant in the day-to-day activities. Except from the certain rich families, women, they have been sharing the cake and enjoying the butter side of the cake. Otherwise, she is always a victim, and most of the time a poor, ignorant, illiterate, superstitious, suppressed lot. So far as 70% women in India as a whole, they are not sharing the joys and happiness of equality, liberty of thought and expression enshrined in our constitutional certain rights and duties, which are beyond the reach, and she is lost in veiled ignorance. Sometimes I have studied in my research the low access to income group and women as a whole. Mr. S. Ram has beautifully studied in his book Women Through Ages, which is for me a kind of Gita. A woman is a constant victim of male debauchery, licentiousness, and contemptuous allusions, and kind of exploitation, even in rural areas of Haryana, where you see the case of present system of scenario of girls, victimization of certain male Mako image, even in schools. That is not a secret to anybody. Stark realism, sadism, and egotistic devices are to be used and adopted by the male Mako image everywhere, especially in rural areas. The situation and the position of woman is so lowered down, what to talk of the upper elite class woman sharing only 7% of the population in urban locale, especially Chandigarh, Delhi, or maybe Panchkula. A woman is a cocooned in her own gender disparity network. She is trying her level best to come out of that cocooned situation, but moreover, the various studies reflect that families always jeer at certain women who are willing to come out from the network of male macho image. My studies may be a bit little and are not in tune with the present time, where people say that all is well with the world. But so far as my studies are concerned, feudal fiefdom in rural villages and neo-rich startups, they are the real perpetrators of crime for the women section. And this kind of compartmentalization of human values and experiences, they are the potential threat of regarding masculine power